back to another episode of now what's called the Asia DeFi Network podcast. And today we're going to continue with our Polkadot series where we talk to the top founders in the Polkadot and Kusama ecosystem. And we have with us today one of the leading projects and uh, targeting privacy in the Polkadot ecosystem, Kenny from Manta Network.
Hey there.
All right, Kenny, it's great to have you here. Would you like to start off with a quick intro of yourself and just like a one-liner on Manta?
Yeah, sure. So, just a quick intro about myself. I've been, I guess, in the blockchain space for a while now. Started more on the mining side back in around 2013. And that kind of got into a lot of issues that I've tried to solve since then in the blockchain space. Initially around like Bitcoin liquidity, because that was a problem back then. But then as more user adoption use cases, right, Ethereum and its Turing completeness came out. I started, thinking more and more about like on-chain identity and privacy. So that's just kind of a little bit about my background. And, I met the founders back in 2018. So it's myself and Victor and Shumo, who are the founders of the project. We all met in Boston. I was going for my MBA at the time over at MIT. And then Victor was studying for his master's in econ. And Shumo was a research scientist at Algorand. And so we were all in the Boston area, and that's how we met, and we realized together that like there is a huge problem with privacy on chain, especially, and so that's a problem we set out to tackle, and that's how we built Manta Network. And the unique value proposition here is that we've seen a lot of privacy projects in the space, but where we really want to differentiate is that we're not asking people to use any particular privacy token. In fact, we're quite the opposite. We're on a mission to privatize all on-chain transactions for various crypto assets.
Awesome. So I think indeed that will be the focus of our discussion, at least in the beginning, right? So which is, what is privacy? Why is it important? And I know it's been discussed a lot of times, but I like to just bring in the angle of Web3 itself, right? I think in the Polkadot ecosystem there is an emphasis on the values of Web3, which include, of course, like the whole self sovereignty and immutability, but also in terms of transparency, right? There's a certain reliance of this like can't be evil kind of thing, or like verify and don't trust. So the ability to verify includes not only the code, but also certain transactions that are happening, who are making them in real time, right? So how do you kind of like think about privacy fitting in to the values of Web3? What does privacy mean to you? Why is it important in Web3?
Yeah, I think when you think about Web3, right, like I think the term Web3 it indicates that we are transitioning into a new stage of, I guess, the bigger picture of the internet. And when you think about the internet and the problems of Web 2.0, I'd say definitely privacy is one of the top issues here. But even so, right, like if you think about Web 2.0, how would I ever see your credit card information? How would I ever see your debit card transactions, your bank account? I can't, right? Unless I steal your identity or, figure out your password and all this other stuff, then there's no way for me to view your transactions. Everything is private, right? And you don't really just come up to people and tell them about all of your transactions. But that's not the case with Web3, right? All on-chain transactions are fully public. And so the only layer of protection currently available for on-chain transactions is this idea of pseudo-anonymity. And I say pseudo-anonymity because, you have your wallet address, but you have all the transactions linked to your wallet address. And so as soon as someone is able to link your wallet address to your identity, they can see all the transactions you've done, which wallet addresses you sent it to, which applications you've interacted with in the past, how often you've interacted with them, right? And so all this data, all this information, not just financial data, but just, if you think 2 to 5 years from now, all the decentralized applications and how you interact with them, that's fully accessible to anyone with an internet connection. And we're already having a problem with that. People are concerned about Facebook having your data or Google having your data. But now with Web3, how about everyone with an internet connection having your data, right? And so, it becomes a bigger and bigger problem. And we decided on Polkadot for a few different reasons, right? Like, self-sovereignty, trust without having to necessarily trust, right? I mean, I think those are all concepts that at first it may contradict the idea of privacy. But if you really dig into it, especially with like algorithmic based approach to privacy, the fact of the matter is that you can still verify. It's not like a transaction doesn't actually happen. It actually does happen. It's just that the transaction itself is obfuscated in a way that it can be proven that it happened, but you would never understand or see the specifics of exactly what's happening. And that's the whole concept behind zero knowledge proofs. But just to stick high level here, going back to why we chose Polkadot is, we believe that privacy needs to be integrated from day one. And so, from there, we decided, okay, we need to set out to find an ecosystem that's burgeoning, that has a lot of potential, and also, where we can be in the forefront of it. And so from that perspective, right, Polkadot already fits the profile. We also need interoperability, because as building as a layer one, right, like or what we've seen is that other projects are saying, come build on our ecosystem. But that gets exhausting, right? Like projects have to choose where to build, whether it's a layer 2 or a layer 1 or Ethereum or something like that, right? So why do we have to ask people to build on top of us? Why can't people just build and we'll connect to them, right? And so that's a unique value proposition to Polkadot, right? Being able to build these types of layer ones. And so, like, with all these factors in mind, we thought that Polkadot was the ideal choice for how we would build our layer one system. And yeah, we're here, and Polkadot has been an amazing ecosystem from both the technical side as well as the community side. So couldn't have made a better choice.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, we covered quite a bit there. If I may just unpack it a little bit, you mentioned the parallels between kind of like verify, but you don't need to know the specifics of the transaction. You just need to know that it was executed correctly, and that can be done via code, and nobody else can tamper with it, right? And the other concept was a kind of a radical transparency almost of Web3, where like instead of these companies having control of your data, but only they can see it, now it's kind of like anybody can see everything, and that's kind of scary. But at the same time, it almost kind of like levels the playing field and kind of opens up the philosophy of like what it means to have privacy, and why do you really need privacy, right? What parts do you need to protect, right? Because I think if we go down into some specifics of like a transaction or an activity, right, there are a few components. So who is doing it, so that part is somewhat protected by pseudonymity, although some people do attach a kind of on-chain identity. Next is kind of what you are doing. So what are you transacting, who are you, what are you interacting with, what contracts, what counterparties, right? And that is the part that seems to be in contention because it's on-chain and transparent. And then I think the last part is kind of like, why are you doing it? So this part is by default private because it's off chain, right? Are you doing it? Are you selling it because you need cash? Are you selling because you're no longer bullish? Are you selling because there's some insider information of this project gonna announce something that is negative, or you are buying because it's a positive thing, right? So uh, since the what who is doing it and like why are they doing it, it's kind of like already private or kind of optional if you like to disclose. Why is it still important to then anonymize what is happening as long as the other parts are kind of like controlled?
Well, I guess that's kind of the irony, right? Because the other parts aren't exactly controlled. The idea that your identity is entirely obfuscated by a wallet address is quite a misnomer, right? You use, for example, a centralized exchange to on ramp, and then you on ramp and withdraw to that withdraw to what you assume to be an anonymous address, right? Maybe not everyone in the world knows exactly it's you, but one, the centralized exchange knows it's you, and two, every other software that the centralized exchange uses to track identity knows it's you as well. And so that type of, that feeling of safety of that pseudo anonymity is honestly just one hack away, right? Because when you have centralized servers with centralized databases, then there's one point of vulnerability to identify as much information as possible. And so essentially, we're bringing Web 2.0 problems into the Web 3.0 sphere. And I think, this is one of those problems that we probably shouldn't want to have if we don't need to have. And so there is that misconception that, there is complete, I guess, obfuscation, anonymity there. And so I just want to clarify, right? So that's kind of one sort of risk factor. And the other one, in terms of why, people don't necessarily need to know why. And sometimes when people don't know why, it leads to even bigger problems, right? Because I'm sure, being in the crypto space, a lot of things are speculative and people like to speculate. People like to think and guess and try to figure out what's going on. And, last thing you want is for a large, I guess, like influential figure purchasing some sort of asset or selling some sort of asset just in the DeFi side, right? And then having the rest of the community sort of speculate about what's going on and, taking subsequent actions that could be not the intention of the original, user. And then if you look into, again, like, 2 to 5 years from now, right? Like when decentralized applications in Web 3.0 really start taking off, the whys, it becomes a little bit more obvious, right? Like a very contrived example would be, I don't know, it's your birthday and I want to buy you a birthday present. And so you see exactly which website I went to, which smart contract I interacted with for what product, right? And so that ruins the surprise. And that's just a very simple kiddie example, right? Like, I mean, maybe you don't want the whole internet to know that you paid for a subscription to something like OnlyFans, right? Like, it's just all sorts of information that, like you think would be okay in Web 3.0 because there's this philosophy of the transparency. But in reality, right, you have to find a balance. And so there has to be that mix of privacy mixed with the public side. And so I think that's what we're trying to bring to the table.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think those examples are super relatable. And if I may bring in some kind of Web3 examples as well, right, where people are, for example, shilling their own NFT profile picture, and they're like, "Hey, I want to show that I have this cool PFP. I want to show I'm part of this community and I own this particular one." But at the same time, I don't want to necessarily disclose everything about my financial transactions. I don't want to show that NFT, but I don't want to use like so many different addresses. I want to manage them nicely. So that is already a challenge. And at the same time, I also want to kind of have an on-chain reputation, right? Where I want to show that I've been contributing to this maybe particular DAO. I've been using this product, and often this is also used for like airdrops and things like that. But maybe I also don't want to know exactly how much I put in or like what is my wealth. But you want to be able to prove that like I contributed to this product. I contributed to this DAO, and you don't need to tie a lot of financial information to that. So I think that the lesson I got from you there is around like the optionality, right? Like when it's a particular thing, like a birthday or like a particular subscription, as you said, you may want to obfuscate that, but you can choose which parts you want to show to the world and have that kind of flexibility as individuals.
Right, exactly. And I think that kind of gets right into the heart of exactly what we're trying to build, right? Because I had mentioned at the earlier that we're thinking about how we become interoperable and bring a privacy layer to other projects, and that's where kind of the Polkadot value proposition comes in. And from our perspective, right, privacy should really be a utility rather than a product, right? So if you think about it, having to go to Manta Network in order to use privacy is good for the project, but it's not really good for a user experience, right? Instead, if you're able to privatize assets directly from your wallet, toggling on and off, or if you're able to privatize assets and do, I guess, transactions in a privacy-preserving manner on other chains within the Polkadot ecosystem, right? Like then it becomes a scenario where you don't even have to worry or care about like the fact that Manta Network is doing it. We're just kind of doing it behind the scenes, right? It's like you open up your laptop and you're connected to the internet, but you don't have to care about who your internet provider is, right? And so like with Polkadot, that's exactly what we're doing. We're providing the optionality for privacy, but you don't have to worry about like who's providing it. It's a toggle feature that's on and off.
Yeah, and indeed that is one of the core kind of like killer features, not killer kind of like properties of the Polkadot ecosystem, right? Or its native cross-chain applications, where instead of like, oh yeah, you use this particular smart contract, or like you work on this chain, it's kind of like all these can interoperate so easily, and any dApp can potentially just use Manta as a privacy layer or as a privacy utility, right? So would you like to just share a bit more about that, this idea of cross-chain applications, which ones are coming up, what do you foresee coming, and how would they work with Manta? Because I understand that currently there are some products on Manta itself, right? Like there's a payment product, there's also a DEX product. So how where are we now in terms of like products, and how will we evolve to this cross-chain functionality, or are we already there?
Yeah. So, I mean, and in terms of a cross chain functionality, right? Like we are, I guess, officially speaking, we are kind of already there, although, parachains haven't officially all launched yet. So, on the test net, we're, I guess, officially there, right? Like we've already done sort of XCM, the cross chain communication across, various parachain projects or future parachain projects, right? Like we've done a test net transaction through XCM with like Akala and a couple of other projects. And, so in terms of the cross-chain communication, it's definitely there, right? Like in terms of our products, yes, we're launching a few of our own products as well, because we do see a pretty unique need for certain services right now. And so in the short term, right, we've got Manta Pay, which is our private transaction product. And so the way that Manta Pay works is that you're able to privatize various parachain assets, including like DOT, and you're able to use that privacy preserving version of that parachain asset and transact it to anyone that you want. Right. And so that's really the private transaction product. And then the privacy swap products, our AMM DEX, is Manta Swap. And so it sounds like exactly what it does. It allows you to exchange various tokens in a privacy preserving manner. But, with all that being said, right, like we are focused on transitioning into Manta 2.0. And that's, our third goal after we launch Manta Swap. And this is where we really focus on bringing all the technology behind the products that we're building and offering out that technology to other parachain projects. Because the whole philosophy here is like, if you're building a DeFi product, or if you're building an NFT marketplace, or if you're building a metaverse, et cetera, you shouldn't need to hire your own in-house cryptography team just to implement and maintain, your privacy preservation, right? Like that should be a service that you can use. And Polkadot creates the perfect ecosystem through interoperability to provide as a service products, right? And so with Manta Network, being able to provide privacy as a service kind of not only alleviates a lot of the technical barriers for other projects to start adopting privacy, but also maintains the mission of, making Manta Network into that privacy utility.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, so it's kind of like we already started testing, and it's already a very clear direction to moving towards. I think Polkadot ecosystem itself is not yet kind of like as mature as some of the others, where there are a lot of live applications where people are using all these products. But it's certainly nice to see that we're already positioning ourselves for this kind of very efficient future. Uh, in comparison, I'd like to just bring in some, perhaps Apple. I'm not sure what it's like apples to apples kind of comparisons. And I know a lot of people have compared Manta to other privacy preserving protocols or projects, which might have different approaches, right? They use like trusted execution environments, or they might also use some form of like ZK rollups. But they have different trade offs, right? I think you mentioned that, for example, like Zcash, you would need to transact in Zcash, right? Or certain TEEs, right? It's about the hardware, about the execution itself, but like the on-chain stuff is not necessarily private. And so there, either we have some benefits, or we have different features, then it can be synergistic. But I like to actually today dive into a comparison with ZK rollups, right? Because to me, this sounds a lot more similar to what you're talking about, whereby like I can have different applications, but I choose to compute on the Manta network, the on-chain parts, so that it is privacy preserving, and potentially I don't know whether it could be more scalable and so on as well, right? So how do you see your comparison versus, say, Starknet and ZK Sync on a conceptual level, and maybe getting to some of the technicals as well?
Yeah, so I think on a high level, in terms of a ZK rollup, analogously, maybe I can kind of stretch it around to try to find similarities, but I think like ultimately the use case is a little different, right? A ZKRollup is primarily used, I guess, on on one layer it's privacy, but on the other layer it's primarily geared towards scalability. And so, the way that it works is, you have batch transaction processing, but the way that happens is that there is that step where it becomes, a public transaction goes into a private transaction, and then it comes back out on the other side as another public transaction. And whether or not that purpose is for privacy is potentially secondary to the fact that it just creates that performance layer so that you have better scalability, better performance, especially for like layer 2 ZK rollups. For us, it's a little bit different, right? Like we're not taking a public asset, privatizing it, and then spitting it back out as a public asset on the other end, right? Like we, because we are our own layer 1, we have a UTXO model. This allows for permanent wallet addresses, which means that I can deposit, for example, 10 dots, and I can use that the private dot to send, I don't know, 3 private dot to you, and then 5 private dot to someone else. And then that someone else can take that 5 private dot and continue to send, right? Like you can have an entire universe or ecosystem of private transactions that never leaves the network. And so in that sense, right, it's a little bit different than just the roll-up concept.
Right, right. So if I may just kind of paraphrase that a little bit, from the roll-up perspective, firstly, the objective is a lot about scalability. It might achieve some of the privacy properties, but fundamentally, you kind of like sending from public to private back to public. Whereas for Manta as a privacy prism, kind of layer 1 in itself, you can have assets on the network and transactions on the network that doesn't necessarily have to leave. And so, what does this mean for projects who want to use this privacy layer, right? Does that mean that their assets have to be kept in, this private form, right? Or what specifically do they need? Like, how much will they rely on Manta? How big of a part would it play in, let's say, a full dApp? If you may just walk me through.
Yeah. So anything prior to the privatization of the asset is on the original network. Anything post privatization of the asset is on Manta Network. But this is kind of where the importance of cross chain communication plays such a vital role, right? Because despite the fact that the asset is on Manta Network, certain transactions, certain interactions can still occur that can be brought back to the other parachains, and that creates that sort of complexity cross-chain communication that we're looking for with the Polkadot ecosystem.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah. So the
That makes
private
sense.
Yeah. So the private assets, in a way, have to be minted on the Manta network. But either before that, you can do whatever you want it, or after you make it private, you can also have whatever arbitrary interactions you want with it on different chains with different functionalities. And then if you ever want to kind of, I guess, go back to a non-private, you can come back to the Manta network and unwrap it, so to speak. Is that correct?
Right. Yes.
Awesome,
Yes.
awesome.
We are using that's the concept of a wrap.
Great, great. Yeah, so I think thanks for unpacking that, because I think this is quite a unique kind of way of running the cross-chain apps, right? I think like across all these episodes, we're trying to like unpack the idea of a cross-chain app, which is still so nascent in the Polkadot ecosystem. So it sounds like if we may think about the target users then, right? Because we have a few different stakeholders that you can potentially work with. One is, we talked about like the end user themselves, right? But then you also mentioned that the end users should not even know that they're using Manta. They should just enjoy the properties of privacy, right? So does that mean that who then is the actual user of the technology of the layer, right? Is it, the dApps themselves choose to like build on different parts on different chains, or is it even the chains themselves, right? The different other parachains who choose to then collaborate and then like by default, make it such that it's even more seamless, be it like more point to point or different type of transaction formats. How closely integrated do you need to be with these different stakeholders?
Yeah. So we keep talking back to the Polkadot ecosystem, and we're going back again. But we are, so if you think about it, right, like we are providing privacy as a service to the implementer, the other parent projects, so they can provide privacy as a value proposition to their user base, which is the users who are transacting. And perspective, right, you can almost say that our direct customers, direct users would be other Parachain projects. Of course, we have our own services with like Swap as like our short-term projects and products that we're launching, which we would be interacting directly with the users. But in the long term, right, being able to bring this value proposition to other Parachain projects means or implies that the Parachain projects themselves would be our primary, user base. And then they, trickle down that value proposition to their community. But that makes it very interesting for us and very, I guess, like appropriate for the Polkadot ecosystem, because in Polkadot, right, with cross-chain communication, it's not just like one day I'm just like, oh, you know what? I'm going to just connect to, I don't know, Moonbeam, because that's not how cross-chain communication works, right? I have to, or Manta Network essentially has to write out the right code in order to implement cross-chain communication. And on Moonbeam side, Moonbeam has to write out the right code to implement XCM to Manta Network as well. And so like there has to be an agreement in place, right? Like Moonbeam and Manta Network have to agree that there should be cross-chain communication because both sides have to open their doors. And that kind of speaks to the greater sort of community aspect of Polkadot, because this encourages projects to collaborate, right? And so like we want, especially with our project, right, with privacy as a utility and trying to bring privacy to as many projects as possible, being in an environment where projects need to collaborate in order to be successful, like that's the perfect sweet spot for us to really grow very quickly. But yeah, so that's kind of how our cross-chain communications work, I guess.
Thanks. I know we were kind of like talking about it from like many different angles, but it's all helpful. It's all super helpful. Right.
Right.
Now, I think since we're talking about Polkadot itself, right, shall we just go into some of the mechanisms on Polkadot? So we know that there's a canary net, or kind of like an incentivized test net or a live test net with real value called Kusama. And then there's Polkadot itself, right, which is then the main ecosystem. And we've had these parachain auctions or crowd loans on the Kusama net as well, now happening on Polkadot.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one question we always ask every Polkadot project is how you're thinking about it conceptually, right? The differences between Polkadot and Kusama. While there is a kind of default answer that Kusama is supposed to be where you expect chaos and try out all these new features, but realistically speaking, once you have certain assets, right, you can't just do that, right? And there is its own community, and there are assets on there that you want to protect and incentivize, right? So are they kind of different communities? How are they different? How are you approaching it differently? I think drawing upon, for example, your fair launch on Calamari, right, or more of a fair launch concept, right? So would you like to just share more about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, just specifically about like the parachain auctions and, our, we, with our community launch for Calamari token, we especially felt this. On Kusama, it's very community driven. And like we won the 7th parachain auction, and we actually broke records for the amount of contributors to our parachain auction, right? We had over 16,000 unique addresses contribute. And if one thing I really like to do during that time was look at our charts, right? We had a graph on our page, but also dot market cap. I love going to dot market cap and just looking at the charts. And you see on Kusama, the charts trend pretty linearly, right? But then when you watch the Polkadot auctions, right, you see like, this trend linearly, and then this like spike, and then this trend linearly, and then this spike, right? And so like what that really implies is that the community definitely is very different here, right? Because Kusama, it's a lot of the community, the smaller guys, and they believe in projects and they want to support them, and you get small amounts of allocation every now and then, right? But on Polkadot, there are a lot of large institutional investors and whales that are holding and ready to deploy. And so you see like these quick spikes of like just like contributions in the crowd loan. And so, just from looking at the data, you can definitely distinguish between the two ecosystems. And that speaks volumes to how these ecosystems may or may not diverge, right? Yes, Kusama is intended as a canary net, as almost like a live test net of sorts. But the reality is, as you mentioned, right, like they are completely different ecosystems and they have completely different communities. I think one of the things that we as Manta Network needs to do is we need to create a separate Telegram for the Calamari community. And we didn't think about this at first. And I think a lot of projects are starting to feel this, right? Because Calamari community really cares about Calamari, and not all of them care about Manta Network. And so when we start talking about Manta Network, these people on Telegram, they're just like, okay, but what about Calamari? What are you guys doing with Calamari? Right. So like they are pretty they can be pretty exclusive ecosystems. And the way that we see it is that it is starting to diverge, right? We see projects that are launching on Kusama that will stay on Kusama and not, they have no intention on launching on Polkadot. And, vice versa can happen as well. We see projects that are going for Polkadot parachains that don't even have Kusama parachains yet, right? And so like there's this interesting dichotomy that's created. And so, after like maybe I don't know, 6 months, a year from now, we're probably going to see a pretty, a handful of projects that are similar on both Polkadot and Kusama. But I think we're going to see a lot of projects emerging that are exclusive to one or the other network. And so that kind of speaks to the fact that, if you launch on Polkadot, it may be a different value proposition when you launch on Kusama. And so that's something that, for us, that's something that we're pretty conscious about and wanting to be focused on, because privacy as a utility can manifest in different ways, and different projects have different like ecosystems and value propositions and things they care about. For example, Kusama with Remark, right, like huge NFT marketplace, wildly successful, and there's not really something that's just as huge and popular as Remark on Polkadot yet. Especially because Polkadot doesn't even have parachains, right? And so, like, privacy for NFTs, that could be a focus on Kusama that may not necessarily be a focus on Polkadot. But who knows?
Awesome. Yeah. So it is, you find it indeed differentiated. I think this is a common thread as well, right? More community driven for Kusama, more institution driven for Polkadot, and therefore different use cases, right? That's quite interesting to when you bring in like the whales and the institutions, because I think the previous examples we talked about were more kind of individual centric, like why I want to preserve my privacy. Now, when we talk about Polkadot and more whales, more institutions, I wonder whether the case is stronger or different, right? Because I remember in some of your other appearances when asked about like who's your target customer really, and you mentioned it could be institutions who will be like the first wave because they often have a business need to obfuscate or keep private some of their activities. But also this is a bit weird, right? Because one of the previous episodes we talked to Alex from Nansen, and his entire agenda for the Nansen product is transparency specifically for institutions, whereas he thinks that individuals, like, fine, yeah, of course you can preserve privacy, but if you're big, right, we need to know, like, it's kind of like an investigative journalism in a way, or in how in the traditional finance world, like, you kind of make sure that these public figures disclose their stock trading behavior, or public companies need to disclose an insider trading behavior, right? In like the case of institutions in Wales, how do you then position Manta?
Yeah, I think there's definitely use cases for, I mean, on any level, whether it's institutions, whales, individuals, right, where transparency is and should be required. But there are a lot of other use cases where it becomes a little tricky of sorts. So I think another very relevant and timely but contrived example is you're a fund, and there's a lot of funds that focus on the Polkadot ecosystem, and so they have a lot of Polkadot ecosystem portfolio companies. And now it comes time to the Polkadot auctions, and they have to support these projects. What do you do? who do you support more? Who do you give more to? Who do you give less to? How do you do so in a way that doesn't offend every other project, right? And so, like in this case, privacy is important, right? Like you want to there's a lot of factors that go into how people think about contributing, whether it's on an individual level or on a fund level, right? And like all those processes and thoughts and the logic behind it it's respectable. But at the same time, right, like if I saw that one of our investors gave everyone else, I don't know, like 500K dot, and then they gave us 10K dot, I would be pretty offended, right? But like there might be a really good reason why, right? But like they don't necessarily want to tell us why because it's kind of their IP. And so that's a very, again, contrived example, but it's a very real example for like what's happening right now. And so, as I mentioned, right, I agree. There are a lot of use cases where the transparency is important, but there are also a lot of use cases where, like the transparency isn't necessary and could just cause more issues than, just having that privacy layer.
Definitely. So, I mean, this from the fund side, right? But now, thinking from Manta's perspective, wouldn't you want to know, right, how much investors are contributing? Wouldn't you want to know that they actually play their part? And if they didn't, like, wouldn't you want to ask them as well, right? The reason.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, right? But like there's certain information that, people want to give and certain information that people don't want to give. And so, who ultimately gets to have that deciding factor, right? Should it be private? Should it not be private, right? Like it's not up to us to decide. But I think it is up to us to give people the optionality of what they want to do one way or another, right? Maybe one fund wants to do it all privately, and their portfolio companies are okay with that. And then another fund wants to do it all privately, and their portfolio companies aren't okay with that, right? And so it's on a case by case basis. But in the event that the fund does want to do it, and their portfolio companies are okay with it, then that optionality should be there.
Mm. Yeah. So what I hear from me is it kind of becomes more of like a social contract kind of thing, where because it's not so enforceable and not transparent, the onus is on you to disclose, and you can get a certain kind of like reputation or benefits if you choose to disclose certain activities that can be beneficial to yourself or for your portfolio project that you're supporting.
Right. Yeah. It's nothing's ever as simple as it really seems, right? In theory, it all sounds great, but in reality, is that there are a lot of considerations, and every thought process should be respected. And so, being able to give that optionality, I think, is just a pretty important choice.
Hmm. Exactly. Exactly. So since you were talking about the Parachain crowd loans, right? Let's go back to that. So
Yes.
congratulations, of course, on Calamari securing a Parachain slot on Kusama itself. And I know that we are probably, going to be one of the first few Parachains on Polkadot as well. Would you like to share with us some of the experiences you've learned from the Kusama crowd loan and auction, and how you have adapted that for the Polkadot auction, as well as maybe any kind of like call to actions? What should people know?
Yeah, what's really interesting is that it kind of goes back to your previous question about like how the ecosystems are diverging, right? Like the strategies applied on Kusama aren't necessarily the right ways to apply onto Polkadot, despite the fact that they may have been successful on Kusama. And we saw this firsthand. Um, so, with Kusama, our crowd loan process was pretty chaotic, given the theme of Kusama. But for Kusama, what we did was we did a fixed ratio of rewards, right? So every one KSM contributed gets 10,000 Manta as a base, right? Apart from like all the other rewards with like referrals and stuff. We were thinking about doing the same sort of rewards ratio to Manta Network, right? But when we did that, people were like, "Oh, you know what? Like your rewards aren't that great compared to like what everyone else is doing." And we looked at what everyone else is doing. We're like, "Oh, everyone's just pooling together." And so the strategy for Polkadot is pooling together. The strategy for Kusama is fixed ratio. And so one doesn't necessarily equate to the other in terms of success. And that's true of everything in life, right? And you can cookie cutter one thing and apply it to something else, and it could be a complete disaster. But with that being said, I think definitely there is a lot of technical things that we've learned along the way that would help us with future auctions, right? So like very small things. One is that when you set a hard cap, for example, then that hard cap is hard coded and changeable until the first contribution is made. And then once the first contribution is made, then it's permanent. And then on the, for example, state mine, right? Like the first, I guess, parachain, it's there's certain ticker symbol requirements. So for example, we originally wanted to do Manta's ticker symbol as MA, but interacting with other parachains, there are some requirements to have like minimum amount of letters in your ticker symbol, and that was 3. So we had to change Manta from MA to Manta, which is kind of weird. We were okay with it, but MA had significance to us, not just because of Manta, but because we all met in Massachusetts.
Ah,
Um,
nice.
yeah, but we have to change that now. So there's small technical things that we learned. Bigger learnings were more so just on like the community differences and what people are incentivized by, and like the types of contributors, all things we previously discussed.
Indeed, indeed. And of course, one thing we like to talk about is then the sustainability of auctions, right? I think every project is having their own strategy to build up their own treasury so that they can afford future auctions as well. And I'm sure Manta is having some similar thoughts. Would you like to share, what are some concrete plans that you're really thinking about or put in place in order to win future auctions and be there as a parachain and utility layer for years to come?
I'll break this down into 3 categories, right? One is product, two is, or not product, more so than delivery. One is delivery. Two is reserve, and three is cost. And so I'll kind of go through these backwards. So the cost, right? Like, and we're kind of seeing this on Kusama now, right? Like the cost of these upcoming auctions are actually a lot less than the previous ones. And it was kind of interesting because the dynamics of the first batch made it so that the first batch was actually less expensive than the second batch, right? Because everyone, I guess, started FOMOing in. So the cost, right? Like we do anticipate that the cost of the parachains will be reduced. And we see that already currently trending. And there are 100 parachain slots that are currently trying to be occupied. And then there's this cycle of rinse and repeat between them. But as these once, I guess, very expensive positions become more commodity based, then we anticipate that the cost will be lower. Two is the reserve, right? And so, you can see it in Calamari, you can see it in Manta. We have not released the full allocation of every token, or the full allocation of the tokens we have reserved for crowd loans. And so those allocations work towards future crowd loans as well for rewards for that. And then the third is delivery, right? I think this is the most critical piece because if you can't deliver on your product, then you're held responsible to the community once your parachain expires, right? And so I guess it becomes a question of like whether the community believes in what you're doing anymore. And so if you're able to deliver, it creates this ripple effect of a lot of other things that kind of fall into place, right? Because you create an amazing product or project, and you have a lot of utility for your token. People want your token, right? And so that creates value for your entire ecosystem, and you've shown that you're able to deliver. And so your project is able to hit that next level, right? Like right now, yes, we have test nets. Yes, we've done some sort of collaborations with one another and done like testnet transactions, but the real game begins once mainnet launches, right? And so that's when we really have to show the community that hey, we're not just trying to do some fly by night thing. We're actually delivering products, and that's what we're going to be seeing in the next year in Kusama, in the next 2 years on Polkadot. And the ones that can deliver, I think they're going to have a much easier time in securing continuous parachains. And the ones that can't deliver, right? Like it's just natural selection there.
Nice. So I hear from you like a very strong emphasis on actually the product itself and delivering value to the users. And that's always a great starting point, right? And then we can figure out the value capture later, be it fees and so on, build up your own like sovereign fund to participate in future auctions, or like, the reserve maybe just be enough because the token value may be sufficient to reward users at the lower cost that we're going to see in the future auctions.
Mhm.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, yes. Sorry, you're going to add something?
Oh no, I was just, um, just one other thought is that privacy as a utility, right? Like I think one could argue that potentially it's a public good. It's a utility. It should be a fundamental right within the network, right? And so if we do, it's been an idea that's been kind of floated by, right? Like having us as like, or like not like floated by as in like, Polkadot floated it by, but like internally we're thinking like should Manta Network be a public good service, right? And so like that's also another option of, but at the same time, right, like we first need to prove ourselves. We need to build the products. We need to ship the products. We need to ship out the privacy as a utility, and then we can, figure it out from there.
Mm, mm. That is indeed an interesting path to go down because there is a pathway for public goods parachains as well, right? Which would bypass the whole crowdloan and auction need. Yeah, I would love to see more projects actually start to think about it this way, right? I think previously we saw some things around like bridges and
Mhm.
well other kind of utilities, but we haven't really seen public goods parachains come up, right? So.
Yeah, yeah. But I'm sure they'll start emerging, right? Like we are still in nascency. Parachains are just starting to launch. Projects are just starting to push products, right? And so there's still a long way to go. And last thing you want is a public goods service that doesn't really work well, right? And so we have to prove ourselves first.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, we'll come to that when we need to cross it.
Yes.
So, I'd like to wrap up as usual with a bit of advice that you might have for other founders in general, or specifically for founders in the Polkadot ecosystem. What would you like to share?
Man. So actually, this is something that I think Dan kind of inspired this thought in me. I was talking with him, I think I think either in New York or maybe in Paris. Dan from Akala, right? And so like he was talking to me about like the Polkadot parachains, and we were thinking about like what this sort of implies. And there's a bigger picture perspective here, which is like everyone, we're all so focused on winning a parachain, and then the community is all focused on like getting parachain projects up and running and getting rewards and all this stuff, right? But like there's a bigger impact here because we're one of the first projects that are going to be launching on Polkadot and Kusama, and so we're setting the stage for what the ecosystem will really look like. Right, the right ecosystem will help the entire ecosystem prosper. Right, whereas if it's the wrong projects, right, and it could just be like, oh well, Polkadot is no longer the cool kid in town, right? And so like there's a lot of responsibility there, right? Because like once you secure the parachain, you have to push product not just for your own project, but for the future of the Polkadot ecosystem. And on top of that, right, there's a lot of new ideas, new projects that are currently in development or haven't even started development yet, right? And these are projects that they're going to need help. And so, as one of the first parachain projects, I think like we definitely have that responsibility, not just to push out our own product, but to be more responsible to the broader ecosystem. And so we're all starting to build out the funds to be able to support future projects. And so I think that's a very important step. And I think like, everyone who is building new projects in the Polkadot ecosystem should definitely take advantage of those sorts of treasuries, right? Because like it's not just bringing funds and money to the table, which is very important for hiring the right talent, but it also is, being able to get networked in very quickly, communicate with other projects, which again is a required piece for cross-chain communication, right? Like we have to know who you are. We have to know what you're doing. We have to trust you, right? And so like there it's interesting because that there is that interpersonal layer on top of the technology layer. So for anyone building in the Polkadot ecosystem, right, like one, take advantage of all the grants, the funds, et cetera, that are either already here or will be here. And two, like just reach out. I think the Polkadot ecosystem is positioned in a very unique way where everyone is extremely helpful, everyone is extremely open, and everyone wants to collaborate. And so, those are the two things, I guess.
Nice, nice. One more message to wrap it up. Is
Yes.
there anything else you'd like to talk about, or maybe you'd like to share some call to action for Manta itself, or how can people reach you? Where should people go?
Yeah. I mean, I am always on Telegram. I think everyone in our community has talked to me at least once. So if you want to get a direct answer very quickly, just ping me on Telegram in the community chat. I'm always there. Um, in terms of a piece of information that's pretty interesting is that today is Manta Network's birthday. And so we're officially 1 year old. And so we've done a lot since the project first began, and we're really proud of what we've built and will continue to build. And we are going through the Parachain auctions right now. And so if you are a believer in privacy, and you want to see it in the Polkadot ecosystem, I would definitely recommend that you take a look at us. I think we are the only privacy option for the first Parachain batch. And also it'd be an awesome birthday present for Manta Network. So but anyway, yeah. So thank you guys very much. Really appreciate it. And thank you for all the questions. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was really fun.
Thank you so much as well, Kenny. It's an incredible conversation. Thanks for your time.
Anytime.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and see you next time.
Bye.